I'd like to make an addendum to the Gary Johnson Part 2 video that I just released. I had made toward the end of the video a point about the confirmation bias of the internet age and how multiple news sources has exacerbated the problem of confirmation bias. And I made it kind of sound like I was more in favor of what it was like 20 years ago with only 3 major news sources. That's not the case. I actually believe wholeheartedly that the more choices you got, the better. Information should be disseminated out to as many outlets as possible, and to have a control of 3 like there used to be is not a good thing. So I wanted to make that point. But one of the other issues I didn't get into with Gary Johnson, he made in the end of that, was the fact that he said that kids are smarter today and better educated. I don't agree with that point either. Like I said, the confirmation bias with the multiple news sources is a problem because, in large part, critical thinking skills are not being taught to students or people in general today. So they can't really make a valid judgment of what is true and what is not, who's misleading you and who's not, who has an agenda, who doesn't. So it just makes the confirmation bias more pronounced. And it is really becoming a problem in our society. It's going to become a balkanization. Everything's going to fall apart if we don't at least have good, solid values of how to be good consumers of information. I found some really good definitions on critical thinking that I would like to read to you here. Critical thinking is the intellectual disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or gathered by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. It is exemplary. In its exemplary form, it is based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions. Clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, sound evidence, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness. It entails the examination of those structures or elements of thought implicit in all reasoning. Purpose, problem, or question at issue. Assumption, concepts, empirical grounding reasoning leading to conclusions, implications, and consequences. Objections from alternative viewpoints, very important, and frame of reference. Critical thinking in being responsive to variable subject matter, issues, and purposes. It is incorporated in a family of interwoven modes of thinking, among them scientific thinking, mathematical thinking, historical thinking, anthropological thinking, economic thinking, moral thinking, and philosophical thinking. And on the moral issue, I think it comes to, the 7 sins, 7 deadly sins. Vanity, especially in having your own mindset or view of things, that bias that your view is the only way, and vanity gets in the way, and your ego as well, as to accepting information that may be different. It may blind you because of your own vanity, your own ego. And it is something that we all struggle with. It is something that we have to work at and try to deny that side of our being, our spirit, our minds, whatever you want to call it. And submit to evidence and reason, and just know that we are all here trying to figure out why we are here, what information is true, and I just don't see that being taught. I don't ever remember that being taught to me in school, and I'm sure schools has gotten worse since I was in. Another little piece of the critical thinking definition here. This is from a different definition. Critical thinking is self-guided, self-disciplined thinking which attempts to reason at the highest level of quality in a fair-minded way. People who think critically consistently attempt to live rationally, reasonably, empathically. They are keenly aware of the inherent flawed nature of human thinking when left unchecked. They strive to diminish the power of their egocentric and sociocentric tendencies. They use the intellectual tools that critical thinking offers, concepts and principles that enable them to analyze, assess, and improve thinking. They work diligently to develop the intellectual virtues of intellectual integrity, intellectual humility, intellectual civility, intellectual empathy, intellectual sense of justice, and confidence in reason. They realize that no matter how skillful they are as thinkers, they can always improve their reasoning abilities, and they will at times fall prey to mistakes in reasoning, human irrationality, prejudices, biases, distortions, uncritically accepted social rules and taboos, self-interest, and vested interest. They strive to improve the world in whatever ways they can and contribute to a more rational, civilized society. At the same time, they recognize the complexities often inherited in doing so. They avoid thinking simplistically about complicated issues and strive to appropriately consider the rights and needs of relevant others. They recognize the complexities in issues. They recognize the complexities in developing as thinkers and commit themselves to lifelong practice towards self-improvement. They embody the Socratic principle, which is the unexamined life is not worth living, because they realize that many unexamined lives together result in an uncritical, unjust, dangerous world. That was from Linda Elder in September 2007 as the credit for that last definition. Awesome definition. Just awesome. Socrates was one of the best. I only had a brief introduction to his stuff in college. I took a philosophy class and found the class to be one of the best I'd ever taken, mainly because I read the entire book on my own and followed up and did additional studies on Kierkegaard, which is he was a existentialist. I could go on. I can get off track here pretty quick when I start going into philosophy, but the main point of this was a follow-up to Gary Johnson Part 2 about what they thought about the state of America today, and to clarify some of the statements that I made about multiple sources of information. And by using, I think, philosophy and critical thinking skills, we could do much better with the multiple sources of information and weed out the wheat from the chaff. And I have this conversation not at this depth or of level, but kind of on the level of where do you get your information. And so many people get their information from just a few sources, and it really is a problem in our society that people only get their information from a few sources that confirm their bias towards life. So it is important to read the other side, get multiple stories, interact with people that you don't necessarily agree with so that you can get their point of view. Pull your own ego and vanity out so that you don't get butthurt over someone having a different opinion as you. And that's a challenge. I've always had that challenge my whole life. I think I'm getting better at that. But some days, if I ponder on it too much, it does kind of get my goat. And that's one of the things about the Libertarian Party. I've always felt like it was more the intellectually honest party, full of people who are much more on the side of critical thinking than the Democrats or Republicans. And one of the reasons I'm having a big issue with this Gary Johnson and William Weld, it's like they are just pandering to all the negatives. Like, they are not talking in a critical thinking manner. And in real part, I think in my mind, maybe I don't care about the Libertarian Party being a successful party in the traditional sense, as far as gaining seats. Maybe it's best that we're there to point out critical thinking, to point out consistencies, to point out good economics, good budgets, and to hold fast. Times do change, and what was popular 100 years ago is certainly not popular now. I think the time for the Libertarian Party and a more critical approach will come around, but if we're going to sell out just to get into office, as these two bombs are doing, I just see the Libertarian Party becoming another typical party that becomes corrupt and no different than the other two. So these are just some thoughts I had on the topic of education, Gary Johnson and his platitudes of how great things are, and critical thinking, and how the Libertarian Party, for me, was the party of critical thinking, and now it's becoming the party of, if it feels good, do it. So, yeah, I'm going to move on to part 3, and thanks again for coming back and listening to this addendum. Catch you on the flip side.